It's much more convenient for everybody to say that he was crazy than that he was politically motivated. Because if you say someone's politically motivated, in a way, you're conceding that there might be a justification in what they did.
Hello and welcome to the Aspects of History podcast. My name's Oliver Webb Carter and I'm the editor. And that was Peter Stothard continuing our chat about assassinations. And in particular, we talk about assassinations in modern history going up to as recently as the Iraq War and Saddam Hussein and Tony Blair. So it's a really interesting chat with Peter Stothard. He is the former editor of The Times. So not only is he a master of the Julius Caesar assassination, he also knows quite a bit about politicking and the world of assassination. So we cover modern day assassinations. We talk a little bit about Wilkes Booth and Bobby Kennedy, who was killed by Sirhan. So good he was named twice. Now, I find the Bobby Kennedy assassination fascinating, but we don't go into conspiracy theories. We're just simply talking about that idea that in many assassinations and political killings, the killer is dismissed as a madman, and we just explore that whole idea. And another thing that I did kind of allude to when I speak to Peter is how our language around political killings we use sort of violent language when talking about political killings. And we don't really delve into it too much. But the reason I brought that up, and I forgot to actually mention it to Peter, and I'm mentioning it to you, and I'm going to put a link in the show notes, because there is a interesting video that I don't know if any of you have seen, whereby the language that politicians have used in the last few years in the UK Parliament, that language, not necessarily in the UK Parliament, but politicians that have used in interviews and are members of the UK Parliament, I should be a little bit more exact there, have used language that would not be out of place in a common garden gang that you see all over the world. And with that in mind, I think it was Channel 4 News have put that to a drill musician who has created a video that is that it makes you think. Now, I'm not an expert in drill music, so please don't ask me anything more about that, but it's an interesting idea. Now, elsewhere, on the Aspects of History homepage, we've got a couple of good stuff on the homepage. Alfred Nojoks, the man who started the Second World War. With all the horrors of Ukraine, it's worth looking back to false flag incidents that were created by the Nazis in World War II. We saw a little bit of that with I nearly said Soviets there, which is completely wrong, but from the Russians when invading Ukraine. There's an interesting piece from Roger Morehouse, who's written a fantastic book, friend of the show. We spoke to him, my first ever podcast. I'd recommend that one. And it's all about a false flag operation that kicked off World War II. Also, we have a really fantastic piece written by Catherine Pangonis, who is a debut author. Her first book, Queens of Jerusalem, came out only last year. It's just come out in paperback, and it is a very interesting look on the strong female figures during the Crusades, and she's picked one in particular, Alice of Antioch. Again, that's on the homepage. So I do hope you enjoy those. Now, for my podcast listeners, because you've put up with my irritating voice and style for so long, I have a gift for you. It is a 50% discount on an annual subscription of Aspects of History. So that is simply a code that you can use. The code is history 50% sign, history 50%. I'll put that in the show notes, but you can use that on our website. You get 50% off. It's already a tenner, which is already ridiculously low. And with this, it's only a $5 with this discount. So I do recommend that. Elsewhere, you can get hold of me on the Twitter at OllieWCQ, or you can email us at history@aspectsofhistory.com. But we're going to go over to myself and Peter. We talk a little bit about the first murder post Julius Caesar, and then we go into a little bit more modern day assassinations and how the Julius Caesar assassination has influenced, impacted, affected. I hope you enjoy it. Assassins that are sort of bumped off one by one. I guess once we get to Cassius Parmensis in about 30 BC or 31 BC, and I'm going to end up mentioning Russians again. But if you're an enemy of Putin abroad, you know it's coming, and it's the same with them, isn't it? They know it's coming. But the first one to go to sort of meets a particularly grisly end, isn't he?
Yes, Gaius Trebonius. Yes. Well, I don't think they really did know that it was coming to an extent. It was after Octavian had succeeded in killing everybody, and on pretty much his first line of what he called his res gestae, which is everything I did in my life, when he was at the end of his life. His first thing he said was that he was going to that he had avenged his father's killers. But it was a while before the killers really realized what this was going on. I mean, first of all, a law was passed that exiled and meant that you could kill the people who'd actually killed Caesar. But that was not so uncommon. I mean, I don't think that's created absolute sort of panic as such. I mean, you could get away from it. That had happened in Rome before. And then they passed another law saying that anybody who helped the assassins or was sort of sympathetic to them could also be hunted down. And that created a great terror. And at that point, yes, people did leave the country and start preparing for the battle that had to come. But yes, in between time, some people were rather caught. And Trebonius, I'm sure, had no idea when he was in Smyrna, the modern Ishmael, that the guy called Dolabella, who weirdly was Cicero's son-in-law or ex-son-in-law, they're all totally intertwined. All these people.
He's almost the opposite of Cicero, isn't he?
Yeah, I mean, and he generally has gone down as a bad guy because Cicero didn't like him, and if Cicero didn't like you, the words of history tended to be rather against you. And he certainly did change. He doesn't seem to have been a very reliable ally, but then there were quite a lot of people who weren't very reliable allies. Anyway, he got hold of Trebonius, and I think probably got him tortured to death, more to find out where the money was. I mean, I think he thought that there was money around that would be very useful for him, and maybe he wanted to find out whether there'd been anything more about the plot. I suspect he was much less interested in what Trebonius would tell him about the plot than where the gold and silver was hidden. But yes, he did suffer a very unpleasant death on the Roman rack.
Just moving the assassination onto sort of modern day Western democracies, we do sort of metaphorical assassinations now, don't we? And I was trying to think of something similar to Caesar's assassination, like a public metaphorical assassination, no blood or anything. But I was thinking that, in 1990, when Margaret Thatcher, coming to the end of Margaret Thatcher's premiership, when a succession of cabinet ministers came into her office saying, "You've got to go," and each one repeating the message. Do you think, am I wrong? Is that there no real similarity there?
Well, the only similarity is that that if you've got an unpopular, very powerful person who you want to get rid of, the people who get rid of you will be your closest friends and allies. But I think it's a bit dangerous to start to. I mean, we do use the word character assassination in a rather loose way, and the reason why we feel free to talk about a character assassination is because on the whole we don't do. real assassinations, very much. And in fact, if people do commit assassinations, we tend, and this is always been a bit of an oddity, to think that they're mad. It's become almost like a commonplace to say that if someone like Wilkes Booth, the assassin of Lincoln, he was in fact an extremely political figure with very well worked out argument as to why Lincoln should be killed and was bad. It was a bad thing; it should be killed. But once he had done the deed and they got rid of him, it sort of suited everybody to say that he was crazy, a sort of cracked actor, because no one ever really wants to accept that there might have been any good reason for killing Abraham Lincoln. So even and you don't want to punish all his supporters, because that's very rarely in your interest to do so. You want to try and heal after an assassination. So Wilkes Booth was one of many who was written off as crazy. And the guy who killed Robert Kennedy, it was in no one's interest that for Sirhan to have all his arguments out in court. And I mean, he was a powerful and Palestinian advocate, and he was very hostile to Robert Kennedy, who was considered to be very strongly pro-Israeli. But it didn't really suit anybody to have those arguments out. It was much more convenient to say that he was crazy. And of course, the defense lawyers, the people who are supporting, often want to go down the crazy route too, particularly if there's a death penalty involved. Because if you can say the guy is crazy, then he might just go to jail and be let off at some point rather than executed. So it was both the defense and the prosecution, as it were, often have an interest in saying that an assassin is mad, rather than an assassin has got a carefully worked out plan as to why they were going to do their assassination. And the one thing you can be absolutely certain about in terms of the assassins of Caesar was that they were doing it, politically and for what they believed to be very powerful political reasons, which they wanted everyone to know about. But it doesn't always work out like that. Often it suits people to say that assassins are crazy rather than that they had a different political view to theirs.
And so do you think it's dangerous that because I think you might have hinted at that it's dangerous that we mix the two, the violent killings, with a normal day-to-day political discourse of when we want to get rid of a politician?
Well, I wouldn't say it was dangerous. The only reason we can do it is because assassinations are so rare. I mean, I don't think it wouldn't be considered very tasteful to talk about the assassination of Margaret Thatcher. Actually, Hilary Mantel, didn't she, wrote a story called that, which was rather roundly criticised because it was obviously in her view something which was that's how she saw it. But it's only because we don't have many assassinations that we can use the word as freely as that. You can only say I really want to murder this steak. If you don't feel that someone is going to murder you sitting at the next table, then language is, the words drained of their meaning because their meaning is no longer useful. It's a very good thing too.
Yeah, it is. Although I guess we have more. We think we don't have many, but then we only a few months ago an MP was murdered, and that's 2 MPs in 6 years, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, and both of those were deemed to be. It was very convenient, I think, to say that the people were crazy, wasn't it? I mean, no one. The Joe Cox case, the guy was politically motivated, wasn't it? Wasn't he? He was a sort of
far right guy.
Far right guy. Even then, it didn't really suit people to suggest that was somehow a justification, because if you'd gone too much into that, you might have encouraged other people to say, well, actually, that did constitute an actual justification for killing. It's much more convenient to say that he was a bit of a nutter. And although in that particular case there was reference made to his far right beliefs, I think as the story changed, it was just much more convenient for everybody to say that he was crazy than that he was politically motivated. Because if you say someone's politically motivated, in a way, you're conceding that there might be a justification in what they did.
Yeah, and in today's society, you do have to be a bit of a nutter to do what he did.
Yeah. Well, I want to either a nutter or you're prepared to. I mean, I don't think this is. I don't think we should elevate the killer of Joe Cox into this area. But I mean,
No.
you can. It's definitely giving up your own life for a political cause is not considered and that could include assassination or just blowing yourself up in a bridge or for the sort of religious craziness. We tend to not believe that there's reason behind people who are doing things that we don't like, because we'd rather that they were behaving irrationally. I mean, it's now reckoned that Putin is behaving irrationally. That's a better. I don't know whether he is or not, but it's much more. It's much more comfortable to say that he's behaving like a crazy man than to start picking apart too much the reasons the reasons that he has for doing what he's doing. We don't want to do that because it's intolerable to us that there could be reasons for doing what Putin's doing. So it's much easier to say he's crazy.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think we run you run the risk of you start treating anybody who doesn't do what you think is the right thing to do as though they're insane. I mean, obviously sometimes they are, but anyway, in terms of Wilkes Booth, Sirhan, and they were considered crazy. And one thing that's very important to understand about the assassins of Caesar is that they weren't.
And elsewhere, I've seen you. We're running out of time, but I'm just going to get one more thing in which, again, you wrote about a little bit for us, and then I've heard elsewhere is that just because you can carry out an assassination doesn't mean to say you should. And I think you've mentioned that in the context of you've written a book about Tony Blair's time as during the Iraq War. And I think it was in that context, Saddam Hussein.
Yes, it was. I remember I was in a strange position during the Iraq War.
What was your job exactly when you were?
Well, I just stopped being editor of the Times, and the Times had agreed with Downing Street that for Blair's 50th birthday, I think it was, a journalist would sort of follow him around for a week and just write a sort of magazine piece. That's actually become quite common since then. But actually, at that time, it wasn't very common. It wasn't what prime ministers did. So the Times were quite pleased with this. And but as the war grew nearer, the guy who they'd lined up to do the piece decided he didn't want to have anything to do with Tony Blair and the war. And so they needed someone who could go in at the last minute, to take this assignment. And I'd only just stopped being editor of the Times. It was a very interesting assignment. So I said, I do it. And of course, the war wasn't clear whether there could be a war then, absolutely. But I went in there, and I eventually ended up spending a month there, watching every day of the build up to the war. And it was a very extraordinary time. And the incident that you're describing was when Blair was getting very upset with all the criticism that he was getting for going after Saddam, and people were saying, look, what's so bad about Saddam? Okay, he's a bad guy, but so is Robert Mugabe. So what he called the Burmese lot. There are lots of bad guys around, and we don't go. You don't go assassinating them. So why is Saddam so different? And then Blair said, well, the difference is that I actually can get rid of Saddam because the Americans, for totally different reasons, have decided they want to get rid of Saddam. And therefore, I can get rid of Saddam, and therefore I should. Whereas I can't get rid of the Burmese lot or Mugabe, therefore it doesn't really apply. This is what you might call an unconsequential view of morality. It sort of says that if it's the right thing to do, getting rid of Saddam because he's an evil man, you should do it regardless of the consequences. Most moral decisions in a formal way are often, in politics in particular, are based on utilitarian or consequential views. You do something because it will have a good outcome.
I always got the impression that Tony Blair would think about consequences in all his other political decisions.
Well, he would, but he also understood that isn't the only way of looking at ethics. There is a non-consequential view of ethics, which is that if something is the right thing to do, you should do it. It has a moral certainty in itself. Now, this is not a very fashionable view, and I don't think Tony Blair was particularly pleased to have opened himself up in that way, and it did get him into a certain amount of trouble afterwards. But it is a legitimate way of moral thinking, and Tony Blair at that stage did reveal that was one of the reasons he was frustrated at people criticizing him for the war, sort of a regime change war against Saddam that resulted in Saddam's death, and was obviously pretty much bound to do so. So yeah, it was a glimpse into the Brutus way of thinking of Julius Caesar, if you like, which is that although we say, well, the assassins wouldn't be very pleased because they got the opposite outcome for what they wanted, it is perfectly possible for anybody studying ancient philosophy or any kind of moral philosophy to say, look, it doesn't matter whether we got what we wanted. If Julius Caesar was a bad man and he was above the threshold for getting rid of him, and in our view, and so we got rid of him. And if they then later discovered it hadn't worked out very well, they would say, well, it was still the right thing to do, which is exactly what Tony Blair says about Saddam Hussein. If you ask him about all the millions of people and all the terrible things that happened as a result of the invasion of Iraq, he still says, well, yes, but it was the right thing to do. And that's what Brutus would have said.
Well, I think that's quite a good place to end it. Peter, thank you very much. Actually, you wrote a book about that as well, didn't you? 30 Days with Blair at the Centre of the World.
Not quite. I think it was just called 30 Days.
Right.
But it was just a diary. People criticised me afterwards and said, well, you didn't make enough points. You weren't analytical enough. You weren't sufficiently opposed to the war. You weren't sufficiently pro the war. You weren't. But at that stage, I was literally.
They wanted you to come down on one side or the other. Oh,
well, that's afterwards, but that's what people said. But in fact, it's a document that I think is probably worth more. And certainly, it's often cited in history books now because it was a absolutely plain, unvarnished account of everything I saw and heard inside Downing Street in the places where I could see or hear, or where I could see or hear it. So I've got no regrets about doing it that way, but there was quite a lot of criticism at the time.
Interesting. Well, I'll put a link in the show notes for that, and as well as, of course, The Last Assassin, The Hunt for the Killers of Julius Caesar. Peter, thank you so much for the time. It's been really interesting talking to you.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Okay. Wonderful to talk to Peter, and so fortunate of me to speak to him as well, because not only is he a great classical historian, written this fantastic book, The Last Assassin, The Hunt for Julius Caesar's Killers, he also, as former editor of the Times, can give that modern day perspective. And so, as we heard with the Tony Blair and some of the other assassinations and some of those horrible killings that we've seen in this country, in the UK, very recently. So, very much enjoyed talking to him. Coming up next week, I'm moving slight shift to historical fiction, and I'll be talking to Mandy Robotham, who's the author of The Resistance Girl. And I'm reading at the moment. It's fantastic. It's a great historical fiction novel all about the Second World War and resistance fighters in Norway against the Nazis, and involves something called the Shetland Bus. Now, I won't reveal any more. You'll have to listen to next week's show to find out more about the Shetland bus. But that should be interesting. So I hope you enjoy that. And if you do enjoy these episodes, I would be hugely grateful if you can subscribe. So that's enough of me. Thank you and good night.